My name is Dan Yankovic. I head the tax division of Blake's for the western part of the country. Blake's is one of the leading national law firms in Canada, and so we are sort of divided in Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver, and some offices abroad like New York or London. And but my expertise is on the tax side of things. So I was tasked to give you a summary of these clean economy tax incentives. People call them interchangeably between clean economy and clean energy, but basically means the same thing. On the next slide, you will see the list of these credits, and we'll get to them in a second. And then the second piece that I'll touch on is the greenwashing, which appears to be quite advanced, frankly, the discussion that I've heard for the last 10 minutes. So those are the two buckets that I was asked to talk about for 10, 15 minutes today, these tax credits and to touch on the greenwashing. So we'll start with these credits. They're essentially, as you probably know by this point, they're essentially piggybacked from the United States. The US, through its what's called the IRA regime, the Inflation Reduction Act, even though they didn't go through the acronym properly, but people now call it the IRA tax regime. Perhaps the history lessons in Washington are not emphasized. But in any event, because of the IRA tax regime, Canada had to react, and a bunch of other countries reacted too, including the European Union through its member states. So in Canada, what we've done to stimulate this transition, if you will, from the conventional oil and gas that we see here in Calgary, is to say, you know what, we are going to incentivize people right away to get into the carbon capture, utilization, storage. So that's one of the credits there. Clean technology, clean hydrogen, and then you will see on the next slide, there's also clean electricity as well, and clean technology manufacturing. So all of these 5 credits are new. All of them are refundable. What that means is if a company engages in a clean technology project and incurs, let's say, 100 million of these expenses to build some plant or buy equipment, it can get up to 30% back from the federal government. And it's a lot of money here in Calgary. There's a lot of interest in this. The projects that I work on are very significant in billions and billions of dollars, and a lot of money is at stake, as you can appreciate that, right? But the projects can range. Obviously, there is no de minimis here that applies. But the feds are basically saying, hey, it's a bit of social engineering, really, what's going on. We are saying to the companies and to the population, please engage in this. We will subsidize it in a way through these credits. And these credits are, as I say, refundable, which means that they can reduce your tax payable. And if you owe zero tax, or you're not generating a lot of income in the initial stages of a project, if you're at a loss or you don't have any tax liability, then you will get a refund. You will get a cash refund. And that was a big win when we had to not lobby, but communicate and exchange comments with the Department of Finance over the past number of years. So all of these credits are refundable. All of them have been passed into law, except the clean electricity, which is still making its way through the channels. In the chart here, on those 2 pages, you will see the rate of the credit, assuming you buy eligible property, and there's a whole slew of conditions. What is eligible property for a particular project? And it's very specific. You would need your engineers and scientists to get involved to tell you that, a particular equipment that you're buying for your project qualifies. But assuming you buy eligible equipment and assuming you meet certain labor requirements, okay, then you would get the maximum credit back, which would be, for the most of these, 30%. The electricity one is 15, and clean hydrogen can be 40, and the carbon capture one varies and goes all the way up to 60%. So maybe what I'll touch on just a little bit more here in the interest of time is that there is this labor requirement. This is the first time in Canada that we are adding certain employment type conditions for a company, for a taxpayer to be able to obtain a maximum credit. In essence, what these labor requirements are is that you have to be paying quote unquote prevailing wages. As you can imagine, that leads to certain uncertainty, because what is a prevailing wage in downtown Toronto may be different from downtown Calgary or downtown Halifax or in rural Saskatchewan or New Brunswick, right? And so there is some nuance there that will have to be followed. There's also an apprenticeship requirement, and this was also piggybacked from Washington and frankly even from across the pond in Europe. The Germans, for example, have a large apprenticeship program in their industry. And so what they were doing in Ottawa is essentially cherry picking from here and there to come up with this Canadian design for these credits. The next point that I think is very important is to know that prior structures may not apply here. And so if you are lending to a company that previously perhaps used a partnership or a corporation, it's not necessarily the case that that is the most efficient structure for these credits, partly because who is an eligible taxpayer varies for these credits. And so the clean electricity is a very good example to be contrasted with the others. The clean electricity credit applies to both Canadian companies and partnerships that is composed of or formed by those Canadian taxable companies, but it also applies to crown corporations, corporations owned by municipalities, pension funds, indigenous communities, etc. And because they've broadened the net, the credit rate here is reduced to 15%, because they don't want to be on the front page of the Globe and Mail to say that they've given this massive credit to a tax-free pension fund or some crown corporation that pays no tax. And so, but if they participate in some clean electricity project, they too would be able to get some refundable credit up to 15%. So there's a lot of politics here involved as well. And I see the question, are the credits available to lenders that are lending to companies? It doesn't quite work like that, because the lender would not be incurring the expenses. It would not be incurring the expenses to buy the eligible property. Where the lenders come in and where we are seeing this from a lending perspective is, how can a lender use this incoming receivable credit, if you will, from Ottawa as some form of collateral, or can it be used as bridge financing? Because in the United States, people can sell these credits essentially. That is not the case in Canada, or at least that is not the market that has developed so far. So all of this is new for us north of the border. And for now, you can see, when this got passed a few months ago, and you can see some of these applicable dates when this begins, we haven't really developed some practice or trend or norm that we can say this is what you can or cannot do. But we are getting a ton of questions from the large banks and certain other lenders as to what they can do with this, because the companies are saying, I need money from a lender to go build this project, to borrow money from you to build this project so that I can hopefully meet all of the criteria and get this credit, full credit of 30%, for example, in the clean technology space, right? So that's what the companies are going to be coming to the lenders and say, they're going to say, I fulfill all of these conditions and I meet all of the criteria. And so please lend me the money that I need to get so that I can build this project and get this credit. The issues for the lenders appear to be, so far, from what we can tell in this evolving space, is that there's an element of recapture. What that means is that if the company does not fulfill all of the conditions and gets caught on a future audit, then that company has to pay back the money to Ottawa on that future audit, okay? By that point, the logic would go that the lender has already, in the past tense, given the money to that company, right? So what kind of protections should the lender have or put in place, probably contractually at a very minimum, right, to make sure that the lender is not exposed, right? And in any way, shape, or form, because presumably, you would want to be paid first, right, as a lender. And so the contract here will matter a lot, right? And you could see in certain partnerships, for example, that are being formed for these projects, that if all of us form a partnership and we borrow money from a lender, that the lender should say, in my personal opinion, that whatever credit we get from Ottawa, that credit should be used to first pay us back, and then whatever is left over gets distributed as a refund. This refundable credit gets distributed to the partners of that partnership, right? But those are the kinds of questions that we are getting, and there is really no market practice that has established itself over the past 12 months. I mean, some of this stuff has just come into law. Previously, people were just circling around this and asking some questions how it could potentially work. Well, now this is the law, and it's going to take a bit of time to see how this is happening, or how it will evolve. But what I can say is we are seeing parental guarantees happen, where the lender says, fine, I will lend you, Gary or Andrea, $100, but your parent company better guarantee that I'll be repaid. The other interesting thing that we are seeing is that folks are economically, contractually trying to allocate the benefits of these credits. So if Lois or Abdullah, for example, claim this credit, and they're in a project, and we are all partners in this project, and they're the ones who incurred certain expenses, bought the equipment, qualified for everything, and they get the 30% credit, that contractually in our partnership agreement, we would have some provision that would say, because you've done all of this to get this credit, you will pay less rent, or you will contribute less on something else, and then the rest of us who haven't ponied up on that stuff will have to pay more, right? As part of that partnership agreement. So it's really all over the place. I think from what we are seeing so far, it would be sort of point one, and point two is that there's a lot of interest without much of a market trend / practice. That's sort of where we are at with these credits so far. So maybe I'll pause on that and maybe move on to the greenwashing quickly.
Yeah, is going to be with us on a panel of carrots and sticks, which is talking about this push and pull in the market. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you coast out the hour.
Okay.
I'm going to say before I let you do that
Okay.
I'll see everybody who's in this room, please, on the 12th, to see Dan and ask him questions and meet with him and everybody else. It's going to be a fun day. And anybody who doesn't know about this event, please evangelize. We want everybody out there in force. So with that, I'm just going to let you continue, Dan. Thanks so much.
Okay. Yeah, no problem at all. I think the key points, for greenwashing that I would highlight it sounds like people are generally familiar from what I've heard a few minutes ago. The key points that I would highlight would be more the penalties, um, and make a statement that, previously, um, previously it would simply be the bureau that would initiate complaints, but now you essentially have the private sector that can step in and initiate lawsuits. So that would be like a key consideration that I think people need to keep an eye on. That starting in June of 25, private parties can essentially seek leave from the tribunal and sue a potential, entity for engaging in greenwashing. And then the other point, which I think is on that second slide, is that the penalties here can be very significant. They're administrative monetary penalties, and they're essentially the greater of $10 million if you engage in greenwashing, 15 million if you are a repeat offender, if you will, and the greater of that, and the 3 times the value of the benefit that is derived from the deceptive conduct. Or if the amount cannot be reasonably determined, 3% of the worldwide gross revenues. So it's quite punitive. And for those private parties that we were very much concerned about, the only requirement seems to be for them to get standing in a court is that the proceedings are in the quote unquote public interest. And so you can see why companies making environmental claims should now expect these private parties, some lobby type group, environmental type group, for example, to why we should now expect these private parties, including certain public interest groups, to use this new private right of access to bring claims alleging greenwashing. And I think that's really what I would leave you with for now, that's something to keep an eye on. That previously, this was the tribunal, and the onus was on the tribunal to prove that you did something wrong, a company did something wrong. Now, in a lot of these cases, the onus is reversed. Like, you have to prove that you did not do anything wrong. Like, the onus, the responsibility is on us to prove that we were good to go and did nothing wrong. And this private litigation risk, I think, is going to be a game changer, because the tribunal itself will essentially sit and watch, me or Louis or whoever initiate some lawsuit because it is quote unquote in the public interest. And then you have to incur the expenses to defend yourself, which is why people are dropping all of these statements from their website, right, about what they have done or have or plan to do, because it's just too risky for now. So you wonder on a large macro policy level whether or not the government wanted this. It's almost a contradiction, given the incentives through the tax credits. You're telling the population and the companies, please engage in this, we'll give you the credits. Companies typically would want to then advertise that, promote that, and say, we are in that space, we are engaging in certain green initiatives. But here, if I actually do make that statement on a website, I may be triggering a lawsuit from some public interest group down the road. So there's a contradiction there. Abdullah, I see your hand, and I don't know how much time we have.
Yeah, but let's let Abdullah ask you a question, and then we'll probably leave it until the 12th to continue the conversation.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry for getting my question in so late, but yeah, really interesting stuff. Just for some context, Dan, we saw this happening like 3.5 years ago in Europe. So like consumer marketing authorities talking about EU Green Claim Code. And then we tried to warn H&M that they should take stuff down off their website, and they didn't. And essentially the highlight to kick this off in the market there 3.5 years ago was that they banned H&M to do any sales until they took it off because it was misleading. And then that was essentially like a signal to all of Europe that
Yeah.
this is here and it is here to stay. So just wanted to get your thoughts that is there a regulatory body like the Consumer Marketing Authority in Europe or someone that is looking for that, like if they are piggybacking off of Europe, I would assume it's part of their playbook as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question. I mean, this is in addition, I would say, to certain private or certain other pieces of legislation that can apply here. So there is existing deceptive marketing provisions in the Competition Act. And so in addition to these administrative penalties that I talked about, payment of restitution to customers could also be ordered by some court if the conduct contravenes that general deceptive marketing provision or things like that. So it's very much possible that somebody could, in addition to these penalties, say what you're saying, H&M or whoever, what you're saying on your website is quote unquote deceptive. I don't know if tribunal or the judge tomorrow looking at this would sort of say, I'm going to apply both penalties here on the same point, but it's clearly leaving enough of a chilling effect, right, on companies that they're now starting to just remove statements from their website, unless, of course, they're absolutely certain that they can substantiate those statements and that things have been tested properly and they can stand behind these statements or representations or whatever. So it's quite fascinating, right? Like, and there's no cases in Canada on this point, so it's hard to tell how our judicial system will react, whether or not somebody's going to say, look, people, like, we are engaging in some clean energy initiative. We genuinely believe in ESG or whatever, right? So why shouldn't we be able to say certain things on our website? Like, why are we having to dissect every single statement, right? That would be argument one. Argument two would be, or the counter argument, well, a lot of people are now misrepresenting that they are in this space, right? Like a junior in my office showed me a picture of some soap company that apparently have now said, the soap being produced is carbon. It's like people are going all over the place, right? Like it's almost getting to be too much, right? And arguably that's what Ottawa is trying to say. You cannot just go out and make these statements willy-nilly to make yourself look good if you're actually not engaging in this process, energy transition, clean energy process. But how courts will strike a balance here, it's too early to say at this point, in Canada at least. And yeah. Europe has its own, right, like sort of political nuances, right? Like what is considered appropriate in France or Belgium or, I was just there and I studied there for, years ago in university. Like it's a very different narrative versus, let's say, in Texas or perhaps in Alberta or Quebec, so what somebody would say is inappropriate in Lyon would be very much different from what somebody would say here in Calgary, right?
Yeah. Well, it's a nascent world. Obviously we'll continue this discussion. It's exciting because there's a lot to be considered and discussed. We look forward to hosting you on the 12th.
Look forward to it. Yeah,
it's gonna be great. So everybody, thank you. What a packed hour. That was great. We'll continue this discussion. Thank you, everybody. And we recorded this.